Hello friends, and welcome back to the Hall of Craft! I'm back with another video for you guys, and today I am tackling probably the coolest, gnarliest creature from the book Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, and that is the Elderbrain Dragon. Ever since I first read this book, I knew that that creature was just too cool to leave off the table. I need to have something that represents it in my collection. So that's what I'm going to be building today. But I don't want to just stand here and yammer on at you through the camera about what's cool about this creature. I'm just going to jump into the craft and maybe I'll sprinkle some of that in while we're crafting. Let's just jump into it. So to start out the build, I know that I need some kind of existing dragon figure to start off with because I'm not the most talented sculptor and I definitely don't want to be making this thing completely from scratch. I have this dragon figure that I liberated from one of my old toy boxes at my parents' house. I've had this thing for years and years, and I used to smash it into all my other toys and Lego castles as a kid when I played with it. It's still in pretty good shape aside from a couple of nicks on the tail, but I plan on hacking this thing up anyway. Little did I know at this point in the project, but this dragon figure actually seems to be a collectible. I'm no expert, but from what I've looked up, it's a Series 1 dragon called the Komodo Clan dragon from McFarlane Toys Dragon collection, and from my understanding, they do a bunch of series of these dragons, and this one is actually from Series 1 and does not appear to be in production anymore. So just keep that in mind when you're about to watch what I do to this thing, that this thing is actually kind of a rare collectible. And this occurred to me as I was kind of collecting the footage and getting ready to start editing this video. I had the thought, hey, maybe some of my viewers might actually want to recreate this build for themselves, and it'd be helpful if I could give them the link to the specific dragon that I use so that they can follow along step by step. And that is when I kind of discovered that it's not so easy to find this thing. The best links I could find were on Amazon, and they're a few $100s. So but one of the main reasons why I was gravitating towards this sculpt in the first place was because of the pose. I think it's already in such a great starting position when you compare it to the art in the book for the Elderbrain Dragon. Just the pose lines up so well that I think that this is going to be like a really perfect starting off point. So with something like this, I wanted to approach it with a little bit of a plan. I needed to think about all the individual things that I wanted to do to this sculpt before I just jumped in and started hacking things up. And when you start thinking about that, you start weighing in like what is the easiest way, the order of operations here that is going to cause me the least amount of problems moving in. What steps can I do first that aren't going to impact other steps later on negatively? I'm keeping in mind that as I start diving in, I might change the order of these steps as it occurs to me while I'm working on it, but it at least helps to kind of have a gut check going forward, and it helps kind of eliminate that kind of executive function paralysis when starting a new project if you break it down into smaller bits. So it's not like I have to take on this whole thing from scratch and just do it. I have to do like bite-sized chunks of it. So I'm not doing the whole thing, I'm crafting the tentacles. I'm not doing the whole thing, I'm just crafting the base. And then breaking it up into those smaller steps, I find helps me get over that kind of paralysis at the start of a project. And especially since I only have one of these dragons, it gives me a bit more confidence before I start permanently altering it that I have thought it through and done the necessary steps to set myself up for success. To base the dragon, I have this scrap piece of wood that is actually a cheap Christmas tree ornament from the dollar store. I just sanded down the edges and marked out where his feet would sit roughly. Then I drill out that spot so that I can properly pin him in place. And then I glued some sculpting wire to his other foot. Before I can attach him to the base, I cut out a rough circle of foam core to the size of the base to help bulk it out and hide the wood texture. I poked his pins through the foam core and then covered the wood base with hot glue. I then line it up by feel and press him into place. Once that had set, I reinforced the thin sculpting wire on his left foot with some more hot glue. This piece is holding a lot of weight to just have him in this elevated pose, so the hot glue will help strengthen it up a bit. His original base is too long to fit on this new one, but it has some really cool rock formations. So I'm just going to hack that up and salvage the best bits of it and attach them to the new base. In addition to those rock pieces, I'm going to cut out and carve some more pieces out of 2-inch thick blue XPS foam. I'm doing my best here to replicate the original look and texture of those rock pieces from his natural base. Once I'm happy with the coverage of rocks, I'm going to use this Vallejo earth texture paste to cover the ground and bring all those pieces together. Before that dries, I'm also going to drop some small rocks into it for added texture. After it is dry, I'm just going to super glue a bunch of Citadel skulls all over this thing. How are your players supposed to know a creature's deadly if its base isn't covered in skulls? Okay, now to stop procrastinating mangling up this dragon. First thing, he has a few posable joints. I need to lock those in place, so I'm just gonna drip liquid superglue into them and then spray them with a little bit of accelerant. After the base is dry, I'm just gonna seal it with black paint and Mod Podge. This helps protect any elements from reactivating or warping when it comes to the painting process later. Okay, it's for real hacking time now. First step is these horns. The Elderbrain dragon in the art has these like gooey looking nubbin things, and these horns are really out of place, so all of these sharp horns on the spine have got to go. After all the horns are chopped off, I'll just sand the neck as smooth as I can with some files. In my original plan, it was time to add the tentacles around the neck, but after adding a couple in place, I felt like I should really sculpt out the neck and tail area first. For this, I decided to use a trick that I learned from Goobertown Hobbies. Brent has a whole video where he talks about the scientific properties of epoxy putties. How that matters here is basically that epoxy putties can be mixed and interchanged with each other. They are all kind of compatible, and you can mix and match the various components of them to kind of get the desired finish that you're looking for. So for this, I am mixing some parts green stuff with some parts milliput to hopefully get a finish and a working process that is the best of both worlds. Do you guys think this should be called greeniput or millistuff? Let me know down in the comments. Whatever we want to call it, I'm gonna do my best to use this to bulk out the neck and tail areas. Pressing it into place on the dragon and then sculpting it with wet tools and my fingers. Once I'm happy with the bulking, I'll take what's left of my Milla stuff and roll it into little sausages. These are going to be those little nubbins that span the backside. After it was all cured, I carefully glued all the nubs into place with some super glue. And accelerant is a must for this part. Holding these in place without it would be an absolute nightmare. Once all the nubs were attached, I used some gel super glue and then dripped a big blob of it at the end of each nub and guided it to the base with the nub of my glue nozzle. This will just strengthen them a bit and also add a bit of a gloopy texture and shape to them. Now that the neck and tail were sufficiently bulked and nubbed, it is time to double back to the tentacles. For this, I am just cutting lengths of sculpting wire and placing them from the central back area and attaching them around to the front of his neck and the base of his skull with hot glue. Then, once it's in place, I coat the wires in hot glue to give them the nice tentacle texture. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Elderbrain Dragon and you've been watching this video up until this point, like, Alistair, this is all cool and all, but I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me give you some info on to how one of these things comes into being. One of the few small consolations available to those who must contend with a mind flare colony is the limit of its reach, which spreads only as far as the influence of the colony's Elderbrain. But this small solace withers away when a colony manages to capture a dragon. Teams of mind flayers bind the dragon, which is subject to a gruesome transformation as the Elderbrain latches onto the dragon's back and digs its tentacles into the dragon's brain. An Elderbrain dragon is the nightmarish result of this process. Using the mobility of the dragon's body, the Elderbrain can now serve as a powerful general to Illithid armies, free from the confines of its brine pool. The Elderbrain dragon becomes a psychic threat in addition to a physical one, its body rife with aberrant influence and pulsing with psionic power. Even the Elderbrain dragon's breath weapon mutates during this transformation, becoming a stream of briny liquid roiling with Illithid tadpoles. These tadpoles can swiftly slay victims and transform them into mind flayers, allowing the Elderbrain dragon to grow its own roving colony. Terrifying. Now this next part isn't shown clearly in the art, but in the stat block it says that the dragon can grapple up to 4 creatures with its tentacles. So I'm going to add 4 really large tentacles that look like they are ready to spring forward and strike. Now it's time to put the brain in Elderbrain. For this, I'm going to start out by making a tinfoil ball to bulk it out. I'll just press and mold that into place on the back, making sure that it's not too big. Chopping off chunks of the tinfoil as needed, and then remolding into place. Once I'm happy with the size and shape, I'll glue this brain backpack into place with some hot glue. I wanted to replicate the vibe of the original art and have tentacles swarming out of the brain. So I added a couple more smaller ones right here at the top. This was a small touch, but I think it really added a lot to the vibe of this sculpt. It's giving me really huge Princess Mononoke vibes at this point. To secure the brain in place and add a more organic texture, I cover all of the tinfoil in a thin layer of hot glue and spread it around the nozzle of my glue gun to make sure that none of the foil is exposed. Next, I just mix up some more Milla stuff and cover the brain backpack with it, smoothing it out with wet fingertips. And once that's cured, the sculpting process is finished, and we can move on to the painting process. First thing here is to prime the whole thing black. And I did it with my airbrush because I figured that getting in there with a regular brush around all and behind all these tentacles was going to be a bit of a nightmare. So I have been watching a lot of Ninjon's channel here on YouTube. Lately he is quickly becoming one of my favorite channels to watch. I get excited every time he uploads, and his motto is slay the gray. So I decided here that I would live that motto a little bit and grab some models off my shelf that have been desperately awaiting paint for quite a while. And to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, I'm also kind of bulking out my Illithid collection here at the same time. I got to work on painting these little metal Mind Flayer minis I have from Reaper, as well as the Elderbrain model from the Bones 5 Kickstarter. It felt right to do it this way. The whole set together. After everything was all primed and dry, I gave them all a zenithal highlight. I love this step, especially when working on pieces that I've done some sculpting for, because it is the point when it stops looking like a bunch of hodgepodge items all glued together and starts looking like one finished piece that was supposed to be this way. I also wanted to try a technique here that I've seen on Tabletop Time. I believe it was Murray who did it, where he undercoats his paint jobs with red, blue, and green to give like a big variation in tones, so that when you paint whatever color you want it to be over top, those other tones are kind of showing through and giving a really natural variation, so that one piece isn't all exactly the same color. I wanted to give that a try here, so I just used these 3 tones through the airbrush. It looks a little bit funky so far at this step, but I'm excited to see where this goes. To paint the dragon, I'm going to start with Void Blue, spraying that from below into all of the shadowy areas. For my base coat, I'm going to use Styx Purple. After that, I'm going to start working up my highlights. Layer by layer, mixing in some Wild Violet, and then eventually mixing in some Icy Violet. After all this layering, I think that I've probably completely undone all of that RGB undercoat, and it might not have been super compatible with the layering technique, but lesson learned. You do still see some of these tones on the wings, and the base definitely has it showing through, so maybe not completely a time waster, but I think if I was to do this technique again, I would probably keep my paints a little bit thinner and do a lot less layering. Now I'm gonna mix some Monster Maw with some Blood Red, as well as some purple, to create a nice fleshy color. And then I'll use that color to paint the tentacles, as well as the inside of the mouth. After it's dry, I'll use Reikland Flesh Shade over all of that to add some depth. I want to bring out some more detail to the wings, so I'm just going to overbrush them with some more Void Blue. After that, I'll add some depth to them by dry brushing the edges with Coal Black. Next, I want to tackle this brain backpack. The art makes it look like the brain has either formed a protective shell around itself or cut a slit into the dragon's back and crawled under the skin. Either way, it doesn't have a brain-like texture, and compared to the rest of the sculpt, it just feels a little bit plain. So, using some of the red and blues that are already on my wet palette, I free-handed on some veins. This started out pretty cool, but I got a little sloppy and overdid it in the end with some really chunky lines. I wasn't super happy with it, but at this point I didn't really know what to do about it, and I didn't really have a better idea, so I just left it and moved on. So I went ahead and painted some of the veins that are sculpted into the wings with the same red. After that, I dry brushed some highlights onto the skin with an icy violet mix. And I dry brushed some pink purple highlights onto all of the fleshy toned areas. I wasn't afraid to get too bright with these highlights because even if they get close to white, it will just help them look wet later on. I eventually switched to a wet brush because I felt like the dustiness of the dry brush was not really working on the fleshy areas. Once all the flesh was in a good place, I painted all of the teeth and claws with coal black. And then I highlighted them by mixing a gray out of the coal black with some off-white. After all of this was dry, I decided to give the whole thing an oil wash. I thought this was a good idea because it would help tie everything together, and the model has a lot of detail, a lot of nooks and crannies that wash can go into and really kind of make those pop, as well as hopefully tying the kind of purples, like so many purples on this thing, tying those all together as well as the flesh tones to make it look really cohesive. For this I mixed up a nice dark purple oil wash and then just drenched the whole model with it. Then I used makeup sponges to rub it off any of the highlight areas before it dried. I came back the next day after everything was dry and overall was very happy with how the model had turned out. The oil wash did a really good job of exactly what I needed it to do. But at this point I stopped lying to myself about the brain backpack and decided to sit down and actually paint something on it that I was going to be happy with. The art makes it look like it's a bit of a different tone than the rest of the body, so I wasn't too worried about it standing out compared to the rest that is now post-wash. So I just sat down, grabbed some blues and some purples, and just started glazing it. Doing my best with these kind of really thin paints to try and create that otherworldly, like purple glow look that it looks like it is in the artwork. Not really overthinking it too much here, just kind of going with my gut and what felt right. Moving on to the base. For this, I decided to keep it really simple and try and leverage that RGB undercoat as much as possible. I painted out all of the skulls with bone shadow, and then I dry brushed the whole base with craft paint tan. After that, I mixed up a black oil wash for the Elderbrain and the Mind Flayers that I had been multitask painting during my dragon's drying times, and I used what was left of that on the Elderbrain dragon's base to add more depth. After that dried, I used some suede craft paint to add some dusty highlights back to the raised areas with a subtle dry brush. Now it was time to paint the eyes, and for this, I got the jitters out by painting the Mind Flayer's eyes first. They are way smaller and way harder to get right, so by the time I was done with those eyes, the dragon's eyes seemed huge by comparison. I started by coating them with white, and then I covered that white with blood red. I gave that a few seconds to dry, and then I just added some highlights right to the center with a off-white. The painting process here is pretty much done, but there are a couple extra steps I wanted to do to just take this thing over the top. The first one is adding goo. What is wrong with me? Now, speaking of Ninjon, I'm gonna bring him back up. I have seen him use Uhu glue before, mixed with red paint to create these really cool, like gory blood effects. So I figured I would order myself some, which was a bit of a pain because I don't think it's available in Canada, but it eventually showed up here. And I was going to use it to create kind of like this brine, this elderbrain brine stuff. So the elderbrain that I've been working on simultaneously has volunteered as tribute to be the guinea pig for this experiment. I mixed together a tiny amount of magenta and violet inks in a cup with a decent amount of Uhu glue. And then using a sponge, I start spreading that out on the brain and the tentacles. I left it overnight, and here's how it looked the next morning. Not too bad. Not as stringy as I was really hoping, but it's a cool effect. It adds some nice texture and shine, but no big drips either. For the dragon, I wanted some nice big juicy drips. His breath weapon is literally bile. So I took the package that the Uhu glue came in, and I chopped up the clear plastic into drop-shaped pieces. Then I super glued those drop-shaped plastic strips on the corners of the tentacles in whatever ways felt cool. Imagining the tentacles flinging this goo as they writhe around like snakes around his head. I also cut some bigger drip shapes out of the straight plastic parts and glued those to the inside edges of the mouth, with a couple of larger drops glued all the way in the back of his throat. Now it's goo take 2. Same as with the elderbrain, I mixed up some purple goo and applied it with a makeup sponge. Rubbing it all over the tentacles, letting it drip down onto the clear plastic pieces naturally, and stuffing the glue inside the mouth and letting it cover all of those pieces as well. While I was waiting for the goo to dry, I gave all of the skulls on the base a quick wash with Seraphim Sepia. I've also been imagining his base as kind of Underdark themed, and I wanted to add some plants, some vegetation to it, but not just like regular grass, because like that's not very Underdark. So I have this row of faux fur. I just cut a couple chunks off that, and I made some makeshift tall grass tufts with tack glue on parchment paper. And then I stuck the fur into it, and when it was dry, I painted them with the same inks that I used to make the goo. But with the blue here mostly took over, so it got real messy and weird. I realized that I used way too much ink, and I was worried that they were gonna dry clumped up together, so I pulled out my airbrush and I used it to blow dry them. Once that was done, I just super glued them into place like you would with any store-bought tufts. With those in place, I just repainted the base rim pure black. And I coated the whole thing with a thin coat of gloss varnish. And with that step done, the Elderbrain Dragon is complete. Let's take a look at how it turned out. And that's it, friends. That's all there is to this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, I have plenty of other crafting and painting videos that you can check out in the meantime while you wait for the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you very soon. I don't want to just talk at the camera this whole time. I'm going to tell you all about this creature, but let's just jump into the... No, I fucked it up! All right.